Right. Well, prepare for something perhaps a little different. First of all, let me thank Carleton. Let me thank Mario and Lori for all the help to get myself here. You are saving me from 2 tenure defenses, which I have to go back to on Monday. This is giving me some clear, free time to think about it at night. But I'm really happy to be here. I was dazzled this morning, and I'm sure this afternoon, by the presentations. Students and the other presenters, you're doing remarkable work. So kudos to you. What I thought I would do today, I'm not going to present the equivalent of U.S. Technological prowess in heritage recording, heritage conservation. I want to take a step back, and as the title suggests, I want to talk about why, not how, not when, but why we are so obsessed with materials and materiality. And I want to do it because, well, first of all, because I'm old, and what often happens is reflection comes in to everything that I am doing now in terms of why are we doing this? Why am I doing this now? Why this? Why that? But I also think, as Christina and others can attest to, and I'm going to talk about this more, I'm ad-libbing a bit now, which was dangerous because I only have about an hour. But there was a remarkable sea change that happened about 20 years ago, when the notion of values and heritage was delivered to a professional class of practitioners, academics even, who I think at the time somewhat lost their way as to why they were doing what they were doing. The how and the when kind of usurped the why. And I have to say, materialists like me took a real hit in terms of feeling really bad about ourselves and what we were doing, and that we were just these narrow-minded, material-centric people who wanted to document the nth degree in precision, accuracy, and point clouds. And it's always a good time to take a step back, and because theories change, associations change, heritage changes, it's really important to say, why are we doing this? And why does material matter? I mean, you just heard from about the unbelievable methods that are now at our disposal to capture even the surface topography of a painting. So why should that matter? What do we hope to gain from it? So material matters. Let's see if I can. Oh, I have to do the screen? And where is my advance? Huh? Sorry? I thought there was an arrow up there before. Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay. So I just want to start with this. I had sent this. I don't know if this circulated. I sent this to Lori. And I'm going to read it because it's the premise. It's the manifesto that I'm going to start with. Conservation is a practice in critical need of revised theory, or revisited theory, if you like, a field desperately in want of respectability and to be viewed as creative as the works it seeks to preserve. Now, mind you, I've taught 35 years in a school of design, so you can see where I'm coming from on this. Conservation is not creative in a school of design. The former demands an intellectual platform capable of sustaining robust and challenging questions as to its means, methods, and goals. The latter must redress its long-standing association as legacy caretaker and recognition of its contributions in sustaining, revealing, and redefining existing built works through tangible interpretation. That's tangible interpretation is the part I want to focus on today. So I think there have been a lot of changes in how we perceive and intersect heritage, and I think we want to take that opportunity to revisit what it means to be involved with the material world. So you can take the title of the talk as Material Matters, as in it matters, or you can take it as a noun, Material Matters. I don't care. They both relate to the reality that Material matter is substance, and we even use the word substance to mean something being substantial has importance. So clearly the stuff of heritage matters, okay? Now, the reason, as I said, I wanted to address this is there has been, as I said, a great shift in how we have approached the built works of the past in terms of values-based planning, values-based thinking about what heritage means. And the stakeholder and the public good have come front and center, certainly before the Borough Charter, but the Borough Charter certainly brought this front and center in terms of cultural relativity and all the things that follow. I love this image from India on the left. I mean, I could do with a bit more of this in the States, you know, this kind of image. As I said, we have a long history, a very long history, probably goes back to the Paleolithic. Human beings place a great deal of significance, associative, symbolic, utilitarian, the whole host of values that we talk about today in terms of heritage. But those same values we attribute to and tie to stuff, to matter, to things, whether they're artistic or not, right? It is the tangible evidence of what we're thinking, what we're doing that matter. And there has been, I'm happy to say, there has been a recent return to materiality, as suggested by these 4 of many recent texts that are re-examining the importance, the significance, the meaning of stuff, of tangible heritage. Now, for a long time, certainly when I was the age of the students in the room, it was all about the brave new world was the world of technology, how technology was going to solve the heritage problems. Technology was going to get us away from these arbitrary, subjective valorizations, that it was somehow going to really change the way we did things. It certainly changed the way we did things, but it didn't really change the why. So technology, conservationist technology in the 70s, that's what it was. That was the equation. Conservation equals technology. And whether it was, as it now with laser scanning point clouds, high definition capture of information, or whether it was on the other end, so documentation on the beginning, recording, or treatment intervention on the other end, right? And I'm going to actually show you a case study to show how materiality has really changed or became front and center in a project that had a much broader consideration for what the heritage meant in terms of the social, cultural, even political situation in the Darb al Ahmar in Cairo. I'm going to show you that. Case studies are always a good way to do this. So the field has certainly taken control of its own criticism, beginning the long, arduous task of questioning the inherited dogma of past ages and past definitions. I don't know how many of you realize this, but you know, in the 1840s and 50s, with the final codification of certain thoughts, principles that were being worked out in the European arena at the time, actually beginning earlier, after the French Revolution, in fact, you have to think about it. The theorizing was actually focused on medieval architecture. It was really about a very particular kind of heritage. Now, one might ask, why should all of that theorizing about that particular heritage be relevant to a Le Corbusier building? It's not the object of affection. It was not the object of affection in 1849. And one might argue it's not the same kind of built heritage. It was born of a different age, a different society. So should it have the same universal value, what we now call universal values? Or was the theory developed in the 1840s really developed for a very particular kind of heritage, as it was defined, as heritage was defined? Paul Filippo very appropriately made that recognition that the recognition of historical styles that could be placed in time is absolutely commensurate with the beginnings of restoration theory. You have to be able to see it and know it in order to preserve it. So modern art historical theory and restoration theory actually are born hand in hand in the early to mid 19th century. And these, of course, are just some of the great texts that have guided the development of conservation, from Ruskin's aesthetic theories and theories of age value to Viollet-le-Duc's absolute belief in stylistic unity and a very empiricist and quantitative measurement. One of the greatest documentarians that ever existed. He didn't have a scanner, but he had his eyes. To my hero, which is Friedrich Ratgen, who was the first to say, you know what? I have to apologize. I may slip into preservation. In the U.S., you know, we have to use conservation with a small c to represent all things technical, right? And preservation is what you all call conservation here, I think. But Ratgen was the one who said, you know what? It's first and foremost, when it comes to materiality, a scientific endeavor, and it's all based on etiology. You all know what etiology is? You go to your doctor practices it all the time. It's the study of cause and effect. So for me, this is tantamount, because in terms of the world I live in, what I do, I don't want to treat the symptoms, I want to treat the cause. I'm interested in preventing the damage before it happens. That's preventive conservation. What a new concept. Well, it was around in 1898. And then Cesare Brandi, of course, even in Italian is hard to understand, but you know, major contributions in terms of Gestalt theory and what constitutes the whole of the object. Is the object or the building or the artwork? Can it be missing fragments to really be perceived, appreciated, enjoyed as a whole? And that's all, and that's being contested right now. So values and heritage beginning in '64 with the Borough Charter, the Venice Charter, and then in 1979 a more culturally relative expression of what heritage, or the values inculcated in heritage. And then 2000 was a bit of a watershed year with the values and heritage conservation research that was done at the Getty Conservation Institute, with a series of scholars brought together to ponder the question of what does heritage mean, what are the values that are operating, or that should be operating, in the beginning of the 21st century. And then I had to put a plug in for the Change Over Time. Mario already did that, but we had the opportunity in 2014 to look back at the Venice Charter and say, you know, there were, and at the time there's been a bit of Venice Charter bashing in terms of being Eurocentric, monument-centric, but if you actually squeeze it, there's a lot of important identification of heritage values in that document. But like any document, it needs to, even the Constitution of the United States, it needs to be reinterpreted, right? And that has been done now, not so much as it should be probably, in terms of postmodern critique. I mentioned Filippo Muñoz-Viñas, who's really turned things upside down in his challenge to what we now call classic conservation theory, which believes that the truth is in the object. Now that should be very relevant for all of you, because I've just heard several presentations on, you know, the notion that the more better and precise you can record something, the more truth you can get out of that place. Well, I think there are some cultures on the planet who might disagree with you on that. However, it is the way we think in terms of a modern Western scientific thinking. I happen to subscribe to it because it helps me make better informed decisions, but only in the realm of what can be measured, right? What's tangible. What I'm happy to see occurring now is that more and more conservation professionals are willing to admit, engage, and even discuss in public forum the idea that conservation is first and foremost interpretation. Everything you do is in some way affecting or changing either the tangible evidence of the heritage or it's changing the way the public perceives it. And if it changes the way the public perceives it, you're interpreting, whether you realize it or not. So even when you document something remotely and you haven't touched anything on the building, you're providing data which will change the way people see things. I mean, Eric's example of showing in a museum the three-dimensionality of a painting, most people probably have never thought of a painting as three-dimensional artwork, but yet it is. It has three dimensions. They're just not necessarily visible. So this is a very important point, because we tend to allow ourselves to get put in the corner with the plumbers. Nothing against plumbers. But we're seen as non-intellectual, non-thinking, contributing professionals in terms of interpretation, narrative, and display. And certainly in what I do, I'm very much affecting the presentation as a material conservator. I am changing, and my students change the way we perceive the heritage. And if stuff has that ability to do that, then aren't we doing something very important? You bet. And all we have to do is look at the bad work to know that that's the case. And these are just some great examples, right? From Relic, the idea of the association of person with place. That's an old narrative in heritage, right? Something happened here. Lincoln, actually, this is not even Lincoln's cabin. That's the best part of all this. It's not even real in the historical sense. And then Williamsburg, the idea that if you can make it more accurate, it must be more historical, right? Even if it's a facsimile. And then, of course, that all got blown to smithereens in 1976 when Venturi, Scott Brown, and Rauch took a postmodern approach and said, we'll never know the house that Franklin lived in. We have no images. The archaeology doesn't get us far enough, so we're just going to say, fine, let's still celebrate the person, Benjamin Franklin. Let's do it on the place, because it turns out actually place is more important than stuff, possibly. And let's do it in a way that captures volume, but that's all it does. And so the ghost structure was born. I'm sure this is familiar to you. It's had so many copies since then, but it happened in Philadelphia in 1976. And then a great example in Rome, the Palazzo al Temps, where it's a mashup. So if the ghost house is a translation of an 18th century Georgian house into a postmodern cartoon, then Palazzo al Temps is what in I know your language is a mashup, right? You deliberately say it's not about the author, it's about the reader. It's very postmodern critique. And to say, I'm going to now create something that is new, and it's a bricolage of bits and pieces from all the different periods. Palazzo al Temps has a long history. Which period is more important than the other? I'm not going to say. I'm just going to put it all together, and you decide. Right? That's very postmodern. If you haven't been there, and there certainly are many examples now that have followed since the 1990s when that happened. The other big change that's happened since I was at university was you couldn't get any high-profile architect, starchitect, to pay attention to heritage buildings. They didn't want to deal with it. It was to be associated with those projects, maybe not in Canada, certainly not in Europe, but in the United States, nobody wanted to work on this stuff. But that's all changed. You've got Diller Scofidio, you've got Zaha Hadid's office. These folks, Rem Koolhaas, they all want to work on heritage sites. We always knew they were more interesting. They had more narratives, they had more complexity, but they were not the tabula rasa that modernist architects wanted. And so Philip Johnson, being a student of history, in the 1970s, made some very brave moves to try to make additions and modifications to buildings like the Boston Public Library. And then most recently, this example from Antwerp. Whether you like it or not, it doesn't matter. The point is there's engagement, and there's this response can be explained by the architectural office. That's important. I think that's important. We can't cut this away. We can't ignore it. What else has happened? Well, there's been an embrace of the humankind's dark history, sites of social conscience, It's not just the aesthetically pleasing, the beautiful, but also the sublime, the dark, right? And this is Manzanar, the Japanese concentration camp, internment camp in the West, in America. And then also, of course, history's catching up with us, right? The recent past. This has always been an aspect, the idea of distance, the temporal distance from us. It does seem to be catching up. The old wisdom used to be 50 years. I think it's 25 years now, personally. And some legislation and policy is actually recognizing that. And this was a building lost in New York City. Never should have happened, but it just, it was a situation of politics and lack of support for something that the public simply couldn't get their head around. And one of the biggest changes that's happened is, from remedial, I'm going to treat, the heroic treatments, the Abu Simbel lift and move approach to heritage, to preventive, and to then finally now sustainable. So we've heard the word sustainability a lot here this morning. Certainly it applies to heritage as well, and to move into a stance that looks at the damage before it happens, looks at the context in an effort to try to mitigate, ameliorate causes that could be problematic. And tomorrow I'm going to talk a bit about a big initiative I'm involved with now, which is doing vulnerability studies and developing vulnerability indices for sites on the ground with evidence-based monitoring and recording. I think this is where it has to go. And of course, it was climate change that woke everybody up. If I keep doing the same maintenance and treatments and they're not working, what's the difference? Well, the climate is changing in one example. Or maybe budgets are cut. Right? That's another example. But this has forced us, I'm happy to say, at least at the national government and at the National Park Service, it's finally woken them up to take a good hard look at what are they monitoring, how are they monitoring it, when are they doing it, and what are actually the thresholds that we have to pay attention to. We talk about it, but we actually don't have any good models, at least in the States. So, in our own fabricated material works, time exerts its presence through the telltale signs of material degradation. Time, like space, is all around us. Its evidence is visible in the natural world as cyclical change. All human works pass through time. That passage, regardless of its length, is duration, the time during which a thing, action, or state continues to exist. How buildings are received by each generation depends on the specific conditions of the time and the place. And as time affords a measure of change, both time and change are critical components that shape the reception or the arrival of the work to the present. If you're not conscious of that, how could you possibly intervene on something? You have to understand that it is how it is received. So in our own built works, then, we understand time as material degradation, right? We all get old and we don't look the same, and through stylist anachronism. I'm always amused at that chain of stores called Forever 21, and I see people coming out who are 50. What are they doing in there? If you're 50 years old and you're wearing something you wore when you were in high school, not so good. It's that stylistic anachronism. So those are the two ways. When you see a building, you either say it's of the time or it's not of the time. And if it's not far enough away from you, it's ugly. If it's far enough away from you, it's historic. Okay? And then, of course, everything ages, so we can tell right away. We're very perceptive, right? We look and we say, oh, that's not new. However, there's a fine line between deterioration and damage and age value. It's a very slippery slope, right? So look at these two examples. Ruskin, when he draws San Marco in Venice, he is interested in Gothic architecture. He's more interested in the weathering. And so look at all the weathering on that image. It's beautiful, including the plants. And then on the right, I've been on this project for over 10 years, and it's 40th anniversary now. It's its over 50th anniversary, and it's very hard to get the public. It's very hard to get my parents' generation and part of my generation to appreciate this. You, I hope, appreciate this. By the way, I was a fair goer. I went every week to the 64 World's Fair. And it's a shock for me to see it. I actually worked on it, and I saw it when it was new. It's the first time that's ever happened to me. I've worked on heritage that I saw when it was new. That's really shocking. So these are, age and stylistic anachronism. Now, let me get to the point of all this. So, since time is not reversible and history cannot be undone, only rewritten, preservation is a true historical event. It's a critical human action and it's one of the ways in which the work is transmitted to the future, even if it's destroyed. The Bamyan Buddhists got much more public attention after they were destroyed than when they were whole. And then even signs like this that, seem kind of pointless, indicate, we are tied to the idea of place. That something happened here, and there are many ways to remember it. There are also ways to remember it in its absence. So preservation is an intellectual pursuit, and it's predicated on the belief that knowledge, memory, and experience are tied to cultural constructs, and especially to material culture. You need the material culture to remember, and that makes it a very powerful medium to tell stories and for a whole host of other uses. And the example here, one of the earliest known documented examples of paying attention to the fabric of history is the case of a surviving wooden column in the Temple of Hera in Olympia. So the Greeks continued to keep this one gnarly, miserable wooden column that survived from the archaic period as the temple got reconstituted. And then you probably all know the famous case of Theseus' ship, the paradox. If you keep replacing a board every year in the ship of Theseus, what do you have left? Where is the authenticity of the ship? The American version is the handle of the axe that George Washington used to cut the cherry tree down. Where does the authenticity lie? I mean, it's one of the principles in conservation, right? World Heritage Convention says you've got to define authenticity and integrity because significance is tied to that. So what does authenticity mean? It's not a universally I suspect it is a universal human value, but I don't believe it's expressed the same way across cultures and societies. And I would argue that in a Western tradition, in a Islamic Judeo-Christian tradition, materiality is where authenticity lies, and it goes back to the cult of the sacred relic and the reliquary. We believe that there is aura, power in the substance. The substance is substantive. And you can find examples in all three major world religions, even in Buddhism and in Hinduism. So I think this is at the heart of why we spend all this time on stuff. And if you think I'm stretching it by talking about the sacrality or sacredness of materiality, here are two great examples. I mean, the Liberty Bell was transported all around the country, and people kissed it, and and the blind were healed, and it had all this power. And of course, it was the symbol for the abolitionists in the 1840s. And then Lincoln's Cabin and Shrine, we've seen this already. There is something where you need these symbols in their tangible form in order to carry the narratives forward and inculcate the values that a place, a nation, a country, an ethnic group has. Okay, so this brings us to the famous Matero triad, the triadic model. I always inflict this on the students in conservation because I don't want them, as I suspect maybe most of you are, you can't just live here. You can't live at the bottom of the triangle. You can't, because your concerns with the, I'm really interested in the fabric, the materiality, right? The wood of the beam, the clay and the brick. This is where I tend to do all my research. The architects, engineers, you're interested in form, right? But you have to remember, tangible heritage has three components. It has the materiality and material of it, the form, the structure, which is often the resolution of a design, and then the function is everything intangible. It's the use, it's the meaning. Okay? So this to me is how whenever I undertake a project where I'm planning the approach, the intervention, all three have to be considered. And different projects will put you in different parts of the triangle. In archaeological site conservation, do you think you're up here? It's a ruin. It has none of the original functional value. It may have different functions, associative functions, the glory of Rome, right? The glory of the Incan Empire. But not a building that houses a deity or the uses that it once had. Whereas in archaeological conservation, fabric is everything. And if it's not, we do anastylosis and it pushes us over here, right? We rebuild the form with the old fabric. If we do a replication, it takes us way away from there and puts us up over here. So you can find yourself, I think, you can resolve almost any intervention strategy you might be thinking, but you better be thinking about all three, right? Better be thinking about all three. This is Bernard Tschumi's famous quote: "The most architectural thing about this building is the state of decay in which it is." Yes, that is true. The authenticity lies in the transformation, the life cycle of the building. I would say, and I think he says that, architecture only survives when where it negates the form that society expects of it, where it negates itself by transgressing the limits that history has set for it. So, dream big. Okay, don't be afraid to make interventions, but be clear about what you're doing and understand that some decisions there may be no going back from. All right, so with that preamble, let me with the time I have left, let me turn to a project that I was involved with for 7 years for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, the Historic Cities Support Program. It was involving the revitalization of one particular district in medieval Cairo, the Darb al Ahmar. And what I appreciate so much about this project, I mean, I've worked, Mario certainly beats my carbon footprint by many thousands of miles, but I have been around and I've worked on a lot of projects, but I have to say this one for me really was the moment of truth, because the Aga Khan and the team of professionals from many different countries understood the place of ethnography, politics, economics, and material conservation in the greater integrated scheme that it was called urban conservation in this case. And I really appreciate that, because I think too often we find our respective corners, we practice what we know how to do, and we don't see the bigger picture. So it's a privilege if you can work on a project where you actually can not only respect each other's expertise, but also see it come to bear in an integrated project. I mean, that's really special. So this was a terrific opportunity for me to see that. As you very well know, in the 20th century, historic cities around the world were eviscerated by modern planners' dreams of urban renewal, encompassing highways and megablocks, replacing overnight what took generations to create. And for traditional societies, this corrective surgery, and by the way, this is nothing new. I mean, Giovannoni called it, in what he was doing, the diradamento, or the selective removal of devastated communities, historic neighborhoods, and demolished or isolated monuments. Now, in Giovannoni's case, it was very much informed by an understanding and appreciation of the historic city. In a lot of modern urban planners' policies, it was not. Anyway, the result was a devastation to the people and, of course, to the physical fabric. And if the fabric is changed, then people's lifeways can be changed. Cairo has been experiencing massive growth in the late 20th century. 1,000 people come into the city every day. That has put pressures on all the fabric, particularly housing, in ways that even the evisceration that modern planning had suggested couldn't even address. So the Aga Khan, the Historic City Support Program, has made one of its primary missions, how can one be modern but still live a traditional life? Why do you have to give up flush toilets to have an historic building? Why do you have to give up your street patterns that control your everyday life because they're dead ends? There must be a way to deal with this. And why not invest and appreciate the knowledge embedded in certain ways of building and designing rather than reject them for the latest design in a shelter magazine. These were the challenges. And of course, what's remarkable about the program is Islamic culture takes the form of wherever it is. Or I should say the religious aspects take the form in wherever it is. So an Egyptian city looks different than Islamic city than Zanzibar. Cairo looks different than Zanzibar. Zanzibar looks different than Lahore. And it's because of the cultural context. So there is no blueprint approach to how this is done. There's a methodology, but the result will be slightly different. So on the right, you're looking at the edge of medieval Cairo on the left, and on the right, the great wasteland that was affectionately known as the Darasa Hills, which is really one of the world's largest dumping sites. For 5 centuries, it was the place where the refuse of the city got dumped, creating hills that actually surpassed the height of the fortification walls. So very quickly, by the 17th century, the walls were rendered useless because they had made so much garbage that any army advancing could easily take over the city. Of course, Saladin made sure that never happened. But it created a very interesting modern urban situation because, as you may know or may not know, every Cairene, every citizen of Cairo has less than 1 meter of open space. So they are suffocating with no space, no green. The Aga Khan's gift to the city was to create a green park, a la Central Park, something massive, large. The lung of Cairo, it was called, the lung of Cairo. It also happened to also be the place where they had the great water reserves and these tanks that were buried. So I say this because this whole project I'm going to tell you about actually was born on the wings of an urban infrastructure project. A pity, actually, but nevertheless, we're all opportunists, right? We're going to take advantage. It's a pity that conservation alone wasn't enough to do the project. It actually came out of the first response, which was an urban infrastructure response. Okay, I get it. I understand that. But fortunately, again, because the Aga Khan is a very integrated, the Historic City Support Program, very integrated program, those in the heritage sector said, hey, the border of this great project is, in fact, a World Heritage Site. It's the wall, the citadel and the Ayyubid Wall. So why can't we incorporate that into modern infrastructure? Why is that not part of the assets of being modern, right? And of course, what's on the other side is a very fragile and increasingly rarefied urban environment where the resident population of particularly small-scale manufacturers, artists, small-scale industry, wire makers. It's not just all, arts and crafts. It's all kinds of everyday articles that are used by the resident population. They live and they work there. The government's response was, let's get them out, let's get the tourists in, let's move them 15 blocks to the high-rises we're building, by the way, on agricultural land. Bad idea. So is there no way that this this portion of the city can be brought up to date, address the infrastructure issues, but also save the fabric and the way of life in the process. Can this not happen? Can this not happen? And so that was the challenge. And of course, the Aga Khan, aside from having money, had God on his side. So you know, he had the ability to possibly take this on and succeed. So let me introduce you to the citizens of the Darb al Ahmar. Right? Very traditional place. It's certainly no surprise that some of the ministers, and some of the folks in the administration of Cairo were embarrassed by this neighborhood. It was seen to be backward. It was seen to be not what being modern means. So we ended up sort of playing the role of Robin Hood, right? You know, we actually, these were our clients, not the Supreme Council of Antiquities, although we didn't let them know that, right? So remarkable, remarkable neighborhood. It's the kind of stuff, the kind of place we all go to and we say, oh God, isn't this amazing? You know, it's probably, you know, it's the same story I remember reading in the 70s about the Marais in Paris, you know, that kind of place. And so the idea was, can we not integrate modern infrastructure, the creation of a new park on the lower left, through the rubric of through conservation, whether it's on the upper left a middle class townhouse, you know, an ordinary vernacular urban building. Cairo was full of them. This is one of the last areas surviving. Conservation of the world-class monument, teaching craft and technique, revitalizing industries. You would think Egypt sits on geological beds of limestone. You would think there were quarries producing building stone. Not the case. The cement industry plotted and schemed in the early 20th century by the colonial powers to get rid of every building material other than concrete. And so when we needed stone, we had no place to go, but it was all under our feet. So you get an NGO to come. Get an NGO to come and you say, can you open up a quarry and we'll guarantee X amount of stone, at least for the first 10 years, and then that quarry business gets on its own. It's owned by a local, and now the stone is being supplied for the locals to fix their houses. Can you get a Swedish NGO to make the lime that we need? Egypt's full of lime, bad lime. They use it for agriculture. You can't use it for building purposes. So if you think these are not your problems, they are your problems if you're dealing with the historic heritage, because you have nowhere to go. The definition of sustainability is the solution comes from within, not without. So can this all be integrated? There's the park on the right, very successful, but the locals and the tourists. On the left, housing for the locals. The park on the left, the Darb al Ahmar on the right, with the park as the interface. So what I realized in this project early on was the Ayyubid wall was the metaphorical hinge and the tangible. It was the tangible and the intangible hinge. It was the hinge which really dictated the new on the right and the old on the left. And it had to mediate. It had to be the thing that would get people to rally around the benefits of heritage. Heritage is an asset, the locals, I mean. And it would have to get, it would be certainly there for the tourist to visit, but it also would have to be there for the locals to use. And we were going to do it through a material conservation approach. So on the upper left, there's the wall being buried. That's a David Roberts lithograph in the mid-19th century. On the right, the garbage and the squatter communities that were occupying the site, and they were relocated at their own, as their wishes, as you could imagine. And then on the bottom, a 19th century view of the wall and the garbage dumps. So the work gave us the opportunity to look at the two-sided coin of conservation. The traditional craft-based approaches on the left, and the more scientifically derived methods on the right. That happens to be the YAS, or JAS or YAS systems. I think in Canada it's Rotec. You know, these sort of designer microabrasive systems for cleaning. We couldn't use any water because the masonry is full of salt. So you have to balance the tradition, the craft tradition, and the reinstatement of that, not for nostalgic reasons, not for feel-good, old-timey reasons, but because it's appropriate technology. And it can be used again and again in the community, by the community, for the repair of their own houses. This is not a place where a professional is going to come and be hired to do the work. So you have to build the knowledge, the know-how into the solution. And so we ran the gamut from, petrography of the stone to understand the causes of the damage. On the right, performance testing of the stone. I must have looked at 15 potential quarries to know which stone would be the appropriate one to reopen for the replacement, and then for the locals to use for their own houses. So the Ayyubid Wall, because of the money and the importance, the significance, and the world attention on it, became the flagship, and then it generated enough spin-off that then the locals could benefit from it. And on the left, reinvigorating local traditions of carving and cutting, and on the right, the quarry that got opened. Great story. When we went in the first few rounds of trying to identify the best stone for the project, in terms of performance and locality, we rejected about 60% of the stone. I felt so bad. This poor guy had been, really put his life savings into opening this thing. And he said, oh, no problem. He said, we'll just sell it to the Hilton. Because they didn't have anybody who could quality control, right, the stone, right? So, during the petrography, and in the process, and I was going to give you a whole lecture on, the truth in materials and what we learned from it, but I thought, now I'm not going to do that. That's just walking down a path we've all been before. But there was some really interesting discoveries. We couldn't understand why there was all this ash in the mortars. And I thought, oh, they're just extending the precious lime mortars with ash. And then I had a graduate student do a research project and a lot of experimentation in the lab. And lo and behold, and there had been some other reports in Caesarea. The aqueducts, the Romans used ash-based lime renders in the aqueducts. And then I was working in the southwest in Santa Fe, and I kept reading about Spanish stuccos on the forts full of ash. And then we finally did the empirical work, and we found out that ash is a water retentive agent. It keeps the water from evaporating from the mortars, which means less cracking, which means a much better performance. So we were thinking actually about using sodium gluconate, right, from the petrochemical industry. And I said, why do that? Let's just use ash. It'll do the same thing. And of course, it was a perfect match. So there are lessons to be learned. We know a fraction of the builder's knowledge of materials and how they were best deployed historically. We have to remember to do that. Creating the lime we needed. Here are the lime pits on the lower left, and there's the Swedish NGO doing, by the way, low fossil fuel use for the burning of the lime. So a very efficient kiln, which is burning the lime to make the lime putty to make the repairs. And here's where we get, I'm at the end now, here's where we get to interpretation and display. What's the language of the site to tell the narratives? Don't treat this like a museum. Don't put a sign up and a barricade. You do that in a museum. Let the site tell its own story. You might help it along a little bit. So here's a terrific case. I mean, this is the stuff I love, right? So we're on the park side. This is the side that predominantly the tourists see. And by the way, we had such a fight with the ministry because they wanted to take the wall back to the 12th century. This is Villa the Duke Lives again. The glory years of the Ayyubid dynasty in the 12th century. And, that's fine, but there were more stories to tell, and it was a case of presenting the options. And when the options were presented, and a few trips to Rome, the ministry realized, hey, a city is a living, dynamic thing, and the city changes, and the changes might be as important as the initial or original concept of the building. So here's where, and this is very much a part of contemporary theory now, we say all stories are worth considering, and then some editing may have to happen, but they all should have their day in court, right? And so here's a case where you resolve it. So here's the Ayyubid wall. Here is an arrow slit for defense. Here's another arrow slit that was opened up in the Ottoman period for a house that got put into the tower. And then that house doorway got ransacked and broken. So we said, you know what, let's tell the whole story. So here, for those who want to take the time to see it, and you can go inside and read about it, here's the edge of the arrow slit of the 12th century. Here's the 16th century doorway of the Ottoman house, and then here's the vandaled, broken section. And then here's a little sort of scarpa going on here, a little stairway that we've created to get you from the ground level up into the structure. Because at the time, and the other story that's told is, at the time the Ottoman doorway was made, the garbage pile was that high, right? So you had to get up there. Well, we took that away. So through the power of good design and thinking about the story, the narrative, and how you use the architecture, the place, the setting to tell that, we were able to do that. Now that's easy on an element, right? But what do you do when you have to mediate between grades that are greatly different in time, and you have a living city on one side and a park on the other? And what happens when on one side, so here's the park, here's the Ayyubid wall, and then here's the living city, and it's about a 15 to 30 foot difference. And on the other side of the wall, there are mosques that are visited every day. There's housing in, on, and next to the wall. There are all kinds of activities happening on the living side, and almost none except park visitation on the other. How do you mediate? And how do you keep tourists from invading people's personal spaces? This is very important. Yet for the city, this was the gate. This was a gateway that was long abandoned. And urbanistically, the planners from the beginning said, we want to make sure we reconnect the original access points because the streets reflect that. Why would you create new openings or none at all? That doesn't make sense because we wanted the local residents to have access to the park at no charge. It's their park, even though it also was supposed to generate income from visiting tourists. So all these urbanistic studies were done. So you see, we're going from what's in the mortar to what is the urban plan. The scale is vast. And this is the resolution. I love it. It's such a great project for me to actually see the archaeological fabric preserved, interpreted, and mediated so that you literally walk through time by going down. You see the stratum. We even left the stratum on that. You can't see it. It's where the photograph is of the grade, the horizons of soil. You walk, you mediate the grade difference. You enter through the gate. This was the original gate. And then you go into the city. And it's an exhibit at the same time, but it's also a usable entryway. You don't have to give this up. You understand? It's always, it's a compromise, but it's a discussion. And then just some details of, again, material matters. Material matters. It's important to keep a bit of the plaster of the Ottoman house. It's important to show this is a new safety feature. It's important to show, it's important to not have the public walk on what's left of the original stairs. This can be resolved, and it can be resolved very nicely and safely. And then where appropriate, you might go the distance. Here was an abandoned middle-class merchant house that was built in the 19th century right on the wall. The Supreme Council said, got to get rid of it, it's not historic. We said, wait a minute, you need a place to bring locals and tourists together. Why should the merchants, why should the craft workers here be sending their product to a middleman to be sold in the tourist district of Cairo? Why not do it right here? And in the process, we'll restore the building for you. So the kinds of analysis that we spend a lot of time in the lab doing resulted. Here's the rendering, and I think here's the building before, and here's the building after. This has now created a flurry of interest in seeing Cairo in a very different way. This neighborhood is no longer this downtrodden, dirty, backward place. And the politicians are getting behind it. So my argument is conservation can be a very viable tool in terms of not only foregrounding the many historical and cultural narratives that places embody, but can also be seen as to aid and abet development. And we should remember that these are hand-in-glove opportunities. Thank you very much for your time. I hope it was of interest.
It's not a museum-like experience in any way. No interpretation.
Yes, there's some small waysides, but the architecture.
It's public space.
It is.
It's not separated.
Nope. And we didn't litter up the place with barricades, and everything is there for safety to get you through the space, because you have to experience you literally are changing depth. You're using your 5 senses literally to experience the place. And I think we got to pay attention to that. Yeah.
Thank you, Frank. It was a great presentation.
Thank you for coming.
And I wanted to get, I'm going to turn around because people can't hear my voice. I wanted to get at the issue of revision of theory and the outdated theory and so on, and using reconstruction in that process. And I mean, you can take the Banyan Buddhas as an example.
Right.
You can take the Mostar Bridge, doesn't matter.
Right.
Something that you really recreate, really out of nothing, because there's nothing
Right.
left to recreate it.
Right.
And how then do you deal with theory in that process?
Right. So everybody hear the question? Where does reconstruction fit in the scheme of things in terms of revised theory? I should also say I would probably, that manifesto might be a little harsh. I might say revisited theory rather than revised, because you don't throw everything out. Manifesto usually, throw everything out and start again. I don't think that's the case at all. Viollet-le-Duc and Ruskin are as relevant today as they were then. It's just a question of understanding their context and then seeing where it might be appropriate now. And so in the case of reconstruction, I think for me, even though I must confess I have a bias towards original fabric, and I've dedicated my life to preserving original fabric or some version of fabric, reconstructions have a role, and they would have a role as an option if in a values-based planning process the decision was made that functionality, visual impact, all of those things were important enough to justify the reconstruction. Reconstructions, I think, to use the words of the Park Service in the 1930s, they are the exception to the rule, but they should only be undertaken when they satisfy all the values that no other approach can satisfy, right? So the Mostar Bridge, yes, it's getting from point A to B, but those are two very important points because the bridge is a symbol of reparation, right? I mean, a bridge, it doesn't get better than, it's like a handshake, right? Between two ethnic factions at war, right? So the reconstruction of the bridge was absolutely appropriate in my estimation. The Banyan Buddhas is a bit more interesting. I don't know what the local opinion is on that. And there certainly are many ways to do it, from digital reconstruction to holographic projection to the actual remaking of them. I think you have to remember, for many societies, the making of something is a very important act, and that would have to be taken into consideration. And my concerns as to whether it's 2,000 years old or not are inconsequential. What's important is if the making or the process is important, then that should push to the top.
And if culturally there is no relationship between the African society and the Buddhists, then the making of it is what?
If there's no understanding, appreciation, or desire to have it reproduced by the current Afghan...
Reconstructed for tourism.
For tourism reasons.
But what you were arguing was a cultural gesture.
I was, yes. But that goes on the list. I mean, the economic value or the value of celebrating a chapter in the history of the country, of the place, if that was deemed significant enough, the question is who's making the decisions, how many voices, then that would be a justified reason, I would think.
Anyway,
Let's take another question.
Can you go into more detail on how you tackled accessibility between the old and the new fabric thing?
Right, so that was one example. As you can imagine, it's 1,800 meters long with about 5 gates. Some gates were gone. Those were not reconstructed. Simple entry points were made with no fanfare. By the way, we're not talking about vehicular traffic through any of them, because the park, small electric vehicles, but nothing much. I think the bigger question was we had an ethnographer on the project. They surveyed and had interviews with almost all the families. By the way, my favorite definition of a neighborhood came out of this project. One resident told us the neighborhood stops where we stop calling the children of our neighbor's daughter. So I appreciated that, the female children. I would say in most cases, some cases the gates were preserved, in other cases they were gone, like this one. The French had reinstated some gates under Napoleon when he came through in the 1790s. We kept the French alterations. That was a bit of a struggle. We were ready to go either way depending on the Supreme Council. But there's apparently been a shift in the love of things French. But these things in 50 years, someone could decide, no, that's not cool. If you're asking more about the technical solutions, they were geotechnical solutions regarding retaining walls and loads, and but that all got resolved. I mean, there's always a solution. The question is, do you have the ways and means to do it and the desire to do it? So. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. I look forward to the afternoon. Thank you. And then tomorrow.